is where these things clearly don't belong. I have a problem with tower zones in downtown, but I think even if you look at Metrotown and Burnaby, the towers are just an outright failure. So, do we have to build high-rise in order to get high density? In order to put a lie to that statement, I got in touch with people that I know across the country, and I started asking, so where do I go to see some good stuff? And I came up with what I termed the Canadian Quartier, which I presented at a couple of the planning conferences across the country, the CIP stuff. And so when you look at the list, if you consider that Winnipeg, well, what I'm going to use is really their gas down or their warehouse district, all of the stuff that is high density and human scale, it happens back east. So it happens a long, long way away from where we are. And probably for very good reasons, because most of it was developed in the 19th century, when Vancouver was really just a wink in the eye. Now, before I take you on this whirlwind tour of Canadian urbanism, we have to stop at the Shrine and pay our respects to the Vancouver Special. It is really beyond me why this little stucco box gets so much critical attention. It's certainly not because of what it can achieve from the point of view of density. It is clearly a suburban building form. It sort of nets out at about that sort of 3,500 people per quartier, or 12 units to the acre that we looked at before. And yet there are some characteristics about it that are interesting. It's not a Vancouver Special, it's really a bungalow. And in different shapes and forms, it exists in every one of our neighborhoods. And it's incremental. It gets built one lot at a time. There is no land assembly, so there's no extra cost involved with that. It's fee simple, which means that there is no strata fees. You can have a mortgage helper suite. Imagine telling your strata council that you're going to rent out to some people because you want to help pay your mortgage. It puts a door on the street, which has an important implication for neighborhood safety. It puts windows on the street as well. It has a front and rear garden. It has rear lane access. We maybe can park 4 cars off street on one of these 33-foot lots. And I think most importantly, it has human scale. So with that as our preamble, let's go take a look at housing in Montreal. The first thing to be said is that if we're going to build something that is not a tower and it's not a suburb or a sprawl situation, the result might look different to what we're used to seeing in the streets of Vancouver. So the house might have a door on a stoop, and it might be built out of brick and have a minimum door yard, and the windows might be really close to the street, but it won't be an apartment, it'll be a house. It'll be owned by a single person. An example from Charlottetown and PEI, the same sort of thing. The density number that appears on the right, you'll see, will be a little bit lower because this building is maybe 1.5 stories lower than the ones in Montreal. You have brick and you have wood side by side. You still have a front door yard, you still have a front door, you still have a very intimate relationship between the window and the sidewalk. And you probably still have a neighborhood that is pretty nice and the people really know each other, one from the next. Dartmouth, across the bay from Halifax, historic Dartmouth, 1750 for its settlement. The famous salt box, a small building on a small lot, achieves a certain amount of density. Their streets are 50 feet wide as opposed to our chain, or 66 foot. Because it's a 2-story building, the overall quartier density is maybe not as high, but it's still a very vital form of urbanism. And the neighborhoods that it creates are very vital. My friends in Cabbagetown in Toronto tell me that they can't get any gardening done in their front door yards because the neighbors keep stopping by to talk to them. And that's exactly what we want. Neighbors talking to neighbors. They don't have garages because the houses were built before there were cars and there are no back lanes. So they park the car in the street, and as a result, every day when they walk out to their car, or every day when they come home and walk back from their car, they're walking a different path and they're walking across different front doors and different people. So they all stay connecting. And the gossiping in Cabbagetown is beyond belief. Everybody knows what everybody else's business is. In Halifax in 1917, there was an explosion in the harbor. It wiped out about 500 acres or 4 quartiers worth of poor housing. It was rebuilt with hydrostone, a special concrete block, and it was rebuilt in this kind of a fashion, in duplexes and quadruplexes and so on, 2-story buildings. And the remarkable thing about it is that they were fronted on streets that had boulevards that are up to 100 feet wide. So the density is not very high, but the result is magnificent. And it's not just the houses up front on these boulevards that benefit, but also the neighbors around them. So these boulevards connect to a park, and once upon a time they connected to a streetcar line that ran along the end of the boulevards as well. And when I'm there making my measurements and gossiping with the neighbors and so on, I see people walking, they're walking their dogs, they're walking by themselves, but they always seem to be walking along these boulevards. It just seems to be a magnet for people. If we're talking about a comparison between human scale and tower scale, well, it is possible to achieve the density of towers with human scale product. The Citadel in Quebec City turns out to be just such a place. You can see that the building form is not uniform, but that block, or these 4 blocks around me as I'm taking this picture, are about the size of a typical Vancouver block. So their blocks are much smaller in size, the buildings are a little tighter together, and until we started to build laneway housing, we didn't have these kinds of separations between buildings. Now I suppose in Vancouver we can see houses are 30 feet apart from each other. The street here is 50, but in the backyard they might be 30 feet apart. And the density that these things get are about 100 units to the acre, which start to approximate tower densities. And the other way that you can do high density with human scale product is like in Gaston or like in Winnipeg's warehouse district, where you can take buildings that were originally intended as warehouse buildings, 5-story high, and either as apartments or as warehouse conversions, you will achieve those higher densities, especially because here the streets are a little bit tighter packed up, and so you'll get an overall net. It's also possible to look at this kind of building form for affordability. And the way that it happens in Montreal is here on Rue Napoleon, which is 500 feet long and 50 feet wide. In other words, it's a small street. There are small houses beside it on small lots. And so just the size of the land and the size of the building creates the affordability. And the density is shown over here. It's interesting that these buildings here actually pencil out at 70 units to the acre, and these ones here pencil out at 50 units to the acre. And the difference is that these ones have a backyard and these ones don't. So there are little factors that contribute, and those density numbers are not always what they seem. So if you're like me, you're ready to break out the confetti and have a party. We found out how to do high density with human scale. Except that here in British Columbia there's a little problem. This kind of stuff is illegal, and it has been since the incorporation of the city. This business that if you want to own a row house outright and not have it be strata property, like the examples that I'm going to show you from our historic neighborhoods, that business of having the party wall as part of your title is not possible under BC law. It's under review. I don't hear encouraging things, so I don't know what's going to happen. But I think that if you want to break away from strata title, if you want to break away the kind of homogeneous development that we see even here around our beautiful village, the only way they're going to do it is to be able to say, okay, let's build these sort of high density human scale things, but let's go ahead and do them so they can be bought and sold individually, and you don't have to do it as part of a strata council or some kind of a larger development picture. So in Montreal then, to close off the review of things, we see a square. And the other interesting thing about this kind of building form is that it lends itself to building these kinds of urban rooms that sustain social functioning. And that when the urban rooms are surrounded by buildings that are fee simple, then the owners can decide to have 2 dogs or paint their door red or do whatever other adjustment to their situation happens to suit their needs. And when you come on it, or when you're part of that neighborhood, then it gives you a kind of sense of vitality and difference that is just not possible when you're doing tower and podium, or you're doing these 180 strata unit townhouse units. There's something about being fee simple, the right of ownership that seems to impart on these neighborhoods a different sense. Now it's interesting that even in Montreal, you see one of these modern buildings that turns its back on the square. So we have to click away and go to the Marais district of Paris to remind Montrealers where they come from, right? These squares are supposed to be places that are within easy walking distance of a significant number of neighbors, where these neighbors can go ahead and meet and have dinner, but as often as not they might bump into somebody they know without texting or phoning or sending an email, just because you're nearby and you just happen to be there. And that's that idea of social mixing and social functioning that also seems to go away when we start to look at these larger development scales. How am I doing for time?
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Well, I am going to show you some slides that got in here by accident.